Good afternoon. Thank you for coming, and I'm going to wander around. I hope that's okay. If I get too close to that end, apparently we'll get all sorts of strange feedback. And if I go too far in that end, I might end up heading for the station. So probably best if I try and stay in this area. I'm going to speak, as Rob said, for about 10 minutes. And I hope, Rob, you might wave at me after 10 minutes, because I haven't got a watch and I haven't got a clock. Why is Brexit important? Is it still important? And what are the implications of it for the food and drink industry is really my topic. And I have to say that I do these remarks quite a lot. I did them last night at the Labour Party conference to a fringe meeting on food and drink, very well attended. I am doing them 28 times between now and the 1st of December at similar events to this, at trade association conferences and at other public events. And I never present from a script or a slide presentation. And I don't do that because every time I give this presentation, something has changed. So the one I gave yesterday has changed today because of events that have occurred or I've learned of since. So this is an enormously fast-changing landscape. I'm going to try and talk you through 3 different areas of concern that we have in the food and drink industry, and then look at 2 implications of that. So the 3 areas that we're most concerned about are labour force, workforce, and the people in our industry, regulation and the way the industry is regulated and will be regulated in the future, and customs and tariffs. And then I'll say a little bit about the implications of all of those for the transition, about which we've heard a lot in the last couple of weeks. And I'll say a bit about Ireland, a brief foray into the impacts particularly on Northern Ireland and the Republic. So on workforce, this has been a big, I should also explain why you might vaguely think I'm relevant. So I'm the Chief Executive of the Food and Drink Federation, which is the largest trade association in the food and drink space. We essentially represent manufacturers, but I also chair something called the Food and Drink Round Table, which brings together all of the trade associations in food and drink, and believe me, there are a lot, there are over 90. And some of it is really like the People's Front of Judea and the Judean People's Front from Monty Python. It's not clear why there would be some of these. There are 8 for meat, 3 for abattoirs. Why abattoirs should be so split, I don't quite understand. But one of the key members of that round table is the British Packaging Federation. As you will know, 75% of packaging goes to food, so it is a crucial part of the food and drink industry, as is logistics. So logistics, the number of trips or road trips or road hours driven by HGVs and distribution vehicles, 40%, 46% of those go to food as well. And so you have a food chain, a food supply chain, which runs from growers and farmers through manufacturers and processors and to out-of-home catering, contract catering and retail, underpinned by the packaging industry and the distribution industry. And all of those are in the group that I chair for the government, trying to bring some sort of coherence to what we're trying to do. And all of them share these 3 big concerns. First is labour force. We have something like 2.9 million people working across the food chain from farm to fork. In manufacturing, it's 400,000, and of those, a third are over 55, and a third, not the same third, are of European origin. So all of those, so we face 2 particular challenges. One is the churn of older workers leaving the industry, and many of those over 55 are actually over 60, something to do with HNCs and HNDs in the late 1970s, and the large number of people who took those qualifications and are now beginning to leave the industry. And we also have churn from the European workers, because the European workers across the food industry fall into 3 different categories. There are those who are here for good, the majority, I think, who've made their lives here. There are those who are here simply as economic migrants. They're here to make money, send money home, and to go home themselves. And seasonal workers would be a good example of that in agriculture and sometimes in packing. And then there are those who are here on extended stays, often students who've stayed on or people who've come to work here to imbibe the culture. And they may go home eventually, but they're intending to stay. And all of them are crucial in our industry because of this other churn that we have. And it's absolutely the case that had there not been a Brexit, we would have expected the number of European workers in the food and drink industry to rise gently over the next 5 or 6 years. And as we may not have access to them, there are some big implications for how we will do what we need to do. And why might we not have access? Because they feel threatened. They feel threatened in 2 ways. One is, in some cases, not very many, but in some areas of England, the climate in which they're living is not very friendly. So you are beginning to see, for rental properties in the east of England, only British people need apply. And Europeans, non-UK citizens, not welcome. We get daily examples of that at the FDF. The more serious threat is because the currency is devalued by over 20%, their wages have decreased, and if they're sending money home, it is of less value, there is less money, and they can go and find jobs elsewhere, which will pay them back the 20%. So if they've got making a purely economic choice, they may well go and spend their money, spend their time somewhere else. The government has reacted to this climate of uncertainty by bringing forward proposals which they haven't yet detailed, but which are welcome, which say that all those workers who are here for 5 years, have been here for 5 years, can stay. Those who have not been here for 5 years but want to remain and work here can apply. So the ones who've been here for 5 years can apply for what's called settled status. The ones who've been here for less but want a few years but want to stay can apply for what's called leave to remain. Slightly ironic title, I think, in the circumstances. But that leave to remain will allow them to stay long enough to make up the qualifications. What we don't know yet is how much these qualifications will cost, how much registering will cost. It looks as though it'll be about the price of a passport, which is around 90 quid. But if it's much more, clearly that will be a disincentive to people to stay. And the second thing we don't know is whether dependents will be allowed to stay. My guess is they will, because I think the pictures of people being forced to leave and with their loved ones waving them off at Southampton or on the Eurostar is something the government won't want. And the third and most crucial question is, how will these people be registered? Because the scheme will require them to register. And in order to do that, the Home Office will have to register nearly 3 million people in a year. Now, I don't think anybody believes that's possible. Certainly the Home Office officials I talk to don't believe that's possible. And that is one of the things driving Theresa May's recognition that there has to be a transition deal which pushes that date out for another 2 years. That's one of the 3 reasons. The second area of concern to us about the labour force is what happens to people coming in. And we have no clear view yet of what will happen in terms of the labour force coming into the country after Brexit. There was a leak in The Guardian, which many of you will have seen and is widely covered, that said that there would be really quite tight restrictions. For our industry, that would be very damaging. Now, you might say, why can we not supply the needs we have from British workers? And that is a legitimate question. There are 2 main reasons. One is that the UK food and drink industry is the most widely spread major industry in the country. There is a food and drink manufacturing plant, there are stores, there are outlets for restaurants, and there are probably contract caterers in every constituency in the country. We are the most widely spread and dispersed industry, and large parts of the UK have 0 unemployment. There may be places where it is significantly worse, but when you have 4% unemployment, which is what you have now, large chunks of the UK have 0 unemployment in the sense that there are no available workers. And for us, that is a real problem, because those people in those places simply cannot find a workforce. So the question of how many European workers will be allowed in is a big one for us. And it hits very specifically in certain sectors. So, vets in UK abattoirs, 95% of them are foreign. The inspectorate of the FSA, 95% of the vets in UK abattoirs are foreign. That's because UK veterinary schools don't produce enough vets in total for us to use them in the food industry. And those they do produce largely want to do small animal stuff, or the James Herriot thing of sticking their arms up the backsides of cows, rather than work in abattoirs and meat factories. And that sort of example is repeated in many other cases. So 90% of the serving staff in UK restaurants in central London are European. In Covent Garden, it's bigger than that. There are many places in Covent Garden where there are no British staff at all. So the workforce is a big issue for us. The second area of concern for us is regulation, and this is pretty simple. At the moment, food is regulated by the European Food Standards Agency, which creates a single market for food regulation across the UK, and it's implemented by the FSA for England, Food Standards Scotland for Scotland, the FSA Wales and FSA Northern Ireland. Under the devolved settlements that set up the parliaments and assemblies in the late 90s, food and farming was a devolved competence. So theoretically, when regulation moves from the EFSA to the UK, it will then move straight through central government and be devolved to the regional parliaments and the regional power centres, which would mean we would exchange one regulatory regime for four. And there would be different food regulations, or the potential for different food regulations, in Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland and England. That will add cost, complexity and a massive degree of confusion, particularly as certainly the Food Standards Scotland and the other FSA versions in England, Wales and Northern Ireland have different remits and take different and more interventionist positions in Scotland than the other places. And finally, customs. The customs situation in this country is, I think, the most urgent and the most concerning. Right now, we don't have any customs checks on food going through any of the ports in the UK to the EU. That's really quite an important point, because we don't have a customs system that could be put in place to manage that. The customs declaration system, which is being developed, will not be ready for 4 years. So and won't be working fully for 4 years. It will take 4 years from now to get everybody in this country trained up to use that system in a seamless way. Why is that important? Because most food comes straight into the country without delay. Any delays at the ports for fresh food or meat or other products with a sell-by date could mean that those products go out of time while they're on the dockside. And that will mean shortage and complexity. So for us, the customs system is the other urgent one. The two most urgent issues for us are labour force and customs. And without a transition that allows for both of them to be put right, we are going to be in trouble. And that's why Theresa May's speech suggesting a 2-year transition was helpful, but I don't think it's moved the game much further forward. That's a very quick tour d'horizon. Rob.
Excellent.
Okay. Thanks, Ian. Is it on?
There we go.
Yep, we have sound. Okay, so over to the floor. Who'd like to start the ball rolling on the questions for Ian?
I've clearly bored you all into submission. I apologise for that. Gentleman there.
Can you hear me? Hello, hello.
It's not working.
Hello?
That's better. Yeah.
A number of the issues that you've raised existed pre-Brexit.
Yep.
The skill shortage, I remember 10 years ago we were looking for 90,000 engineers by, 2020. Now it's up to 125,000 engineers. So the problem's not going away anyway. The problem's existing, and we've not actually tackled it properly, in my opinion. As an industry, we have, to a certain extent, failed. And now we seem to be worrying about what's going to happen after Brexit. Surely we should still be addressing that problem as a serious one for the industry.
The skills shortage?
Yes.
Yeah, I agree.
And secondly, the customs issues have been existed forever and ever. It's just that now they're going to be more important when we leave. So we failed to tackle your two main issues, and now we seem to be, I don't mean this, I'm not in this idea, but we seem to be suddenly saying this is a problem because of Brexit.
Well, on the customs issue, it is a problem because of Brexit, because of the proportion of food that comes in from Europe. So Europe, we're I think you can argue the numbers, but we're about 60%, 55-60% self-sufficient, the other 40% comes in. The vast majority of that comes from the EU, or via the EU, and that's the crucial bit, and most of that comes from either Rotterdam or the Republic of Ireland. In both cases, right now there are no customs breaks. So there's no break in the transition of those things. They walk straight through. Nobody checks them, they come straight in. The problem is that the ports which receive them don't have any technology to impose any kind of checks on both sides. So it's going to be equally difficult at Calais, and indeed you may have seen that the guy who runs the port of Calais was saying last week that he thought there would be chaos in Calais on the 31st of March 2019, and he was actually encouraging people to go to Dunkirk, where there are already existing checks. The problem in the Republic of Ireland is that the Port of Dublin, which runs all the main exit ports for the Republic of Ireland, has no place. There's literally no space to do any checks. So again, the Irish government estimates that if there are customs controls in Ireland on the 31st of March, it will take 6 hours for the Irish motorway network to close down because they'll all be stacked up. And the problem isn't some people will be able to go through and others won't. Of course there will be some fix, but it only needs one at the front of the queue to screw everything up for everybody. But yes, of course those problems have existed. It's just now they're massively exacerbated because we import 5 times more food from the EU than we do from anywhere else in the world. On the labour force, I agree. I would say the industry has failed to address these issues for 20 years. But nevertheless, what it's done is fix that by bringing in European workers. There is no time in the 2-year transition to fix that, and there is no time to automate, which is the obvious way, and a lot of automation here. The difficulty is that so much of the industry works on such tight margins that the available capital to invest at the scale it would need to is just not there. So I agree it's a long-term problem.
Do you think Brexit is really going to make any difference?
Yes, I think it will make much worse in the short term. I mean, it may force people to adopt radical solutions that would be helpful in the longer term, but I think the British public will be really brassed off about the fact that there is less food, fewer choices, higher prices on their shelves, and I think that will be a reaction. Because the costs will go up because of the customs checks, and because if we do, the issue on tariffs is one I'm not going to address because I think we just don't know, but 60% on lamb, 36% on dairy, unbelievable complexity on things like rules of origin, which frankly should not trouble any of us because it requires a master's degree in administration to understand. Those are big problems.
Okay, thank you. Right. Anyone else?
Is it working?
Yeah.
It's working. I'll touch on one of the last points that you've made, and that is the availability of the workforce and the margins that the industry is working on. Now, do we foresee, in case there is less and less labor availability from the EU, that the industry will be forced to increase its sort of
Wages.
so that it attracts more people? And with this increase of wages, obviously it's going to be easier to justify capital investment in automation. Is there a sweet spot where we may end up, or will wage increase and the automation increase drive the industry to nothing, to being uncompetitive?
Well, we will always need food. We are one of the few industries where the product is assured of a market to purchase it. So everybody's got to eat and drink. But yes, I think you're right. There is a serious issue there about the question of of competitive wage rates. I mean, what we've seen, I think, is a microcosm this year in the seasonal workers. So normally 80,000 seasonal workers come into the UK to do the harvest. This year, only 61,000 have come. So we have fewer people, and as a consequence, the cost of trying to replace or fill the gap has gone up. The other interesting thing about that figure is that normally there are a large number of people who return again and again and again to do the harvest and then go back to their home countries. This year, 42% fewer people have returned to do this. So that is an indication that this is not an attractive place for them to come. And that's because of the currency and to a degree about the cultural issues. So I think that's a microcosm, I think, of what we're going to face about European workers going forward. I think wages will rise, but in a very low margin business, it's going to be extremely difficult not to translate that into price rises, and that's why I believe, one of the reasons I believe that there will be price rises across the food industry. It's very difficult to see how you can hold prices against currency where you're importing a large number of ingredients. 40% of our food is imported, so 40% of it is subject to a 20% increase in cost already, and labour costs rising. As you say, the place to go is automation. But the question of how you do that, first of all, you haven't got time to do that immediately. And secondly, you have a big problem with finding the available level of capital. Now, one of the things we're pressing the government to do on that basis is to give tax breaks for automation. I think they can, and if we're out of the EU, that is much easier because it's called state aid, as you probably know. And state aid is forbidden, subsidies or state subsidies. I think state aid, once we're out of the EU, should be relatively easier, although under WTO it's also banned. But tax breaks for automation, tax breaks for innovation, it seems to me, are going to be crucial to level the playing field post-Brexit.
Thank you. Another question. I've got one while we're at it. On the subject of Theresa May's speech on Friday, did that change anything at all? Or?
I think it improved the climate. I think she gave some welcome assurances that deepened the level of confidence about European labour here. I think she also made the first move to say that we would continue to pay into the budget during the transition. But you saw what happened on Saturday morning and then on Sunday in terms of the continuing warfare in the Conservative Party. So, I mean, if she thought or if it was thought that she was going to buy herself a period when the government had what I would describe rather pompously as a settled will, I think you can forget that. And that's one of the problems, I think, with the whole negotiation. I mean, the Europeans are going to play hardball, of course they are. But also, they are having to deal with a negotiating team which isn't united. They're not entirely sure who they're negotiating with, and the government isn't entirely sure what its line is. It's a sign of, I think, the difficulty that Thursday last week, when they discussed her speech, was the first time the cabinet has discussed Brexit since the election. That's the biggest issue facing our country. Can you imagine the Churchill War cabinet not discussing the war? I mean, absolutely bonkers. And I think it's very concerning that you've now got, these stories that she's going to be removed and all of that. I think that's bad for our stability as well. I also think my final point is that I think the speech she makes on Wednesday, Tuesday or Wednesday, whichever it is next week, is the most important speech of her life. And it's very important for us. As I said, I've just been in Brighton, and this year I'm not here to be a political pundit, but I've been involved one way or another in politics for 40 years. I am pretty sure that Labour is going to win the next election. And there was an extraordinary thing last night in Brighton, extraordinary rally of Corbyn's. There were 20,000 people there. He's hugely popular for reasons I simply don't understand, with young people. Hugely popular. And he's got real momentum in every sense. I think if Mrs May stumbles, we will have a general election, and I think that will result in the return of a Corbyn government. And I think if I were you, I'd be assessing the implications of that for your businesses. Having listened to Mr. McDonnell yesterday, I know what I think, but I'm not here to make that point.